Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love, alongside my co-hosts Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Chris Ferguson. He is a professor of psychology at Stetson University and the author of the book, How Madness Shaped History, an eccentric array of maniacal rulers, raving narcissists, and psychotic visionaries. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on. It's really awesome to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so you were kind enough to send me the book. I think that someone actually on Twitter suggested you come on, and I checked it out. I'm like, yeah, this is good. And it's fresh in my mind because I just finished it. And I had to cut it short because there's so many things I want to talk about. It'd be like one of those Joe Rogan episodes. But I guess I want to start by asking you what made you write this book, because it's interesting in the sense that you talk about a lot of things people will find interesting, a lot of things that Shamika and Will and I get into, talking about human nature and some things that people act as focus on behaviors and why people do certain things, especially politically, and they just toss it aside and just simplify their reasons. But you kind of get in depth and you look at it from a psychological standpoint, like why people do this and what causes them to act these way, and lay it out in examples through history. So, what made you approach the book that way?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I think there's a part of me that in a different life would have become like a historian. I've always loved history. And really the thing I like about history really is kind of like the wacky stories and the gory stories and this sort of stuff, so there are these really great stories in history, and I always had this perception like historians are really bad at telling them to a large degree. And really kind of what I was thinking of was I'd read a few other books, that were in this space of like history and explaining why societies do well and why societies don't do well. And a lot of them kind of focus in on this idea that there are these, which is true. I mean, I don't disagree with it. There are these sort of factors like the environment or the sort of technological developments like steel or the wheel or things like that, or just geography, that these kind of things that are outside of human control are to a large degree responsible for how history shifts back and forth. And I don't dispute that. I think that is very true. But there was this de-emphasis as well on the idea of what's been called like the great person hypothesis, essentially, that individuals matter, that the actions or decisions of individuals can have an influence on the course of history. So it seemed like in the last few decades, at least, a lot of historians were kind of de-emphasizing that. And I wasn't convinced by that. So I really wanted to look at some examples where specific individuals really did matter and really did have some considerable influence on the course of history. And being the sort of person I am, I wanted to focus on how people ruined it. So on the more negative side of that, so we can think of like the positives, the Abraham Lincolns, the George Washingtons, whatever, that had a positive, sense. I really want to talk about the psychopaths and the narcissists and the jerks, or the people who just were, seriously mentally ill, and how they had an influence on history, because those are the more fun stories for me. And that gives you a sense of, I just had this really morbid, sense of curiosity about a lot of things. A lot of things I like to talk about are kind of morbid things. And that's really got what me interested in psychology in the first place. But that's where it was coming from. I really want to tell a bunch of good stories and have people be interested in those stories while making maybe a few points about history and maybe a few points about psychology as well, and kind of where we're going as a field.
Well, I think you used some great examples. I mean, obviously, you're not going to talk about madness and mental illness and strongman and how societies were shaped by individuals without talking about Mao and Hitler. But you mentioned some others. You talk about examples. You open with like Alexander the Great, Idi Amin, and the Blood Countess of Hungary. So I think mixing in some, obviously a lot of myth has been added to as the time has gone by. They kind of embellished a bit. But those are some pretty interesting, larger than life figures and stories there. So tell the people about the Blood Countess.
So Elizabeth Bathory is one of my favorites. I love telling the story to students too because they cringe whenever you hear this stuff. So the short version of this is Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman in the late 1500s, and so she basically developed as a sexual psychopath, and she was gay, she was lesbian as we'd identify it today. So she was attracted to other women, but she enjoyed torturing them. And she was very powerful. She was very influential. She was very rich. So she had a lot of, power at that point to do this sort of thing. This was in an age before, we kind of take it for granted now, the idea that everybody has basic value as a human being. But that wasn't what people thought back then, for the most part. There wasn't this idea that humans had inherent value. So if you were peasantry in Hungary at the time, then your value was relative, not much better than an animal, effectively. And as the story goes, and of course, as you say, some of this is, who knows how accurate the
Let's
stories
hope
are.
they made some of it up.
Yeah. But as a story, and some of this did come out in this is by the point it came out, it was really the early 1600s. A court testimony, but this is Renaissance era court testimony, which involved torture itself and other kinds of things. But in some of the testimony that came out, the story sort of emerged that she eventually got angry at one of these young women who were working for her, who she was already torturing, and raked her in the face with her nails, and ended up getting some of the woman's blood on her own skin. And when she rubbed away the blood, she realized that her skin looked younger and more supple, more moisturized. And so she basically came to the belief that human blood is a natural moisturizer, which it is, it turns out. So she wasn't wrong necessarily. Of course, we have a lot of other options today. So hopefully your listeners aren't, going, oh, well, that's where we go. So she then, again, as the estimates are obviously very vague because it's not like she kept records, but somewhere around 350 to 600 young women were then killed over the course of several decades by her, mostly in this quest of her attempting to stay young. And of course there are all these details that came out in the court when she was apprehended eventually. About the sorts of torture she would inflict on her victim. I don't know how graphic you want me to get for your listeners, but it's pretty bad. It's an R-rated book. Let me tell you this. Don't read out loud for your kids at bedtime. They will not sleep. But yeah, she really inflicted she was very creative, let's just put it that way, in terms of what she would do with some of these young women. And it was only when she began she eventually started running out of peasant girls to torture because word kind of got out. She shifted to the merchant class who had more rights to complain. And it was only then that she got apprehended along with some accomplices. And that's where, her accomplices were put on trial and tortured. And she herself was sentenced to be walled off in her room without any further human contact. It was basically a slit in the wall where food could be passed to her so she would stay alive. And she survived for 4 more years. And again, sort of the allegory of it is she was left in the room with a mirror so she could watch herself grow old. So a little bit of ironic justice in there. But yeah, I mean, so it's kind of the fun of these stories too, is you have to realize that probably the broad outlines probably happened, but then there is always this concern with these, even with the testimony in court, how much of it was embellished under torture, for instance, and things like that. We can never be entirely sure, which to me kind of adds to the mystery and the fun of some of these stories.
Right. So, Shamika, what did you think of the overall approach of his writing of the book? And anything you want to say about this story?
Well, I will say that I didn't get to read every single word, but it is very intriguing. I was thinking about just my own mental illness that I think that, which is undiagnosed, by the way, except for me.
Let's do it here.
I think that, you have to be a little bit mentally ill to do what we do and to even succeed, I feel like, in life. So I think some of the most successful people are just a little bit off. Now, when I heard about this story, I was wondering, is it only the blood of young people, or could I like use my own blood? Because getting older for a woman is rough. So I was really, wondering how deep you went into this research.
Well, I don't think you want to use old blood.
Yeah, I didn't do any experimental trials or anything of that sort. Yeah, no, I think it's and again, I'd be clear, I am not a like animal tissue moisturizing specialist by any means. As I go down this, there's a rabbit hole.
Yeah, you know that's the only reason I brought you on. We expected to talk about that for the whole hour.
My impression is the stuff you can buy in stores is fine. You don't necessarily need to go beyond that. But yes, animal products work. So, and I think, again, I'm not an expert in this area. My impression has been that a lot of actual moisturizers are at least in part, or at least historically had in part, been made of animal protein products, which means they basically ground up some critter, so that it still had that same basic, sort of effect. So yeah, I guess if you're asking, could you, swipe some of grandma's blood while she's sleeping, and would that work just as well? Probably, I guess. But
I was thinking about my own as a menstruating woman. I was just wondering.
Yeah, no, it probably would work just fine too. Yeah, absolutely.
I'll let you know.
Yeah. The only thing that doesn't work is the old story of like the person who's trapped on the island and starts eating themselves. That doesn't work.
That won't work.
Okay.
So that just stop where you're thinking. Don't go any further.
Yeah, just stop.
Okay.
So Will, to follow up on what Shamika said, she made a point. She said, "Well, some people have to be a bit mad to accomplish some of the things that they accomplish." But I think that's kind of the point of a part of Chris's book is that were they mad, and if they were mad, in some of the examples he talks about, did that help or hurt? Right. So it may have brought their downfall, but it may be the reason why they were successful, and what the country would be like, or the empire that they were in charge of would have been like had a different personality been in charge. So what do you think about that?
Well, my personal moral philosophy grew out of being a very smart kid dropped off in a bunch of diverse slum neighborhoods where my mom happened to live. And the core of it is that there really isn't any ultimate right or wrong. I've never noticed that good people are rewarded more than evil ones. There are 10 or 12 things that sort of an honorable warrior wouldn't do. Rape of a tribeswoman, cannibalism, that anthropology generally agrees on. There's some exceptions for enemies. But other than that, moral rules, fucking and fighting would be the classic crude description. Those vary dramatically across highly civilized societies like Japan, Saudi Arabia, and so on down the line. So I don't even know if bad is an appropriate term among adults that are mostly in the social sciences, but I mean, like, most leaders tend to be testable sociopaths or something similar. This is just a fact. There's a whole book, Why Psychopaths Succeed. And there's a whole debate about whether it's psychopathia or sociopathia that makes you succeed. Is it being naturally predatory and aggressive, or is it being brutalized by something like the Marine Corps until you're just ready to compete the rest of your life? And there's stories about this, like pressure breaks pipes, but it also makes diamonds. So a lot of the training courses for warriors historically have been designed to destroy half of them. They can't stand it mentally. That's why there's sometimes a correlation between sociopathy and very negative behavior, alcoholic rages and so on. But the other half build, develop, and go on to lead. When I worked on a pretty major sales and trading floor in Chicago, M. Evans International, we once took one of those sociopath tests. Like, all the men on the floor took it just for the hell of it. And like 75% of us, including me, tested as technical sociopaths. Like, that just means like there are three elements. Chris, I believe, as a psychologist, might correct some of my amateur bullshit. But like risk-taking, being antisocial, like people often say I have disdain for like cattle morality. I make my own rules. Mm-hmm. And just a level of personal aggression. So aggression, risk-taking, and not believing the rules are ultimate. Those things are characteristics of hobos and criminals, but they're also, and make no mistake, characteristics of leaders. Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, most of the people that lead society are very bad people in a Sunday school teacher kind of way. Most morality is just a complete waste of time. Develop a personal code of honor and recognize that aggression will help you lead. There's literally a fucking military motto, who dares wins, from one of our civilized allies. They conquered the world screaming that. But anyway, so that is point one. No, I'm not. I read most of the book. Very well written. I'm not surprised that this is the case at all. I do think another interesting thing, by the way, is Chris, you referred to the rejection of kind of great man theory.
Mhm.
And this is out of field for me, but I've always kind of wondered why that happened. It's probably because of the kind of post-Frankfurt focus on external stimuli. You're never responsible for anything. That'd be my guess. But like, kind of last comment for me, but recently I was involved in one of those online arguments about like, was it whites, blacks, or Asians who domesticated the cow or whatever? And as a result of that, turned out to be South Asians. Apparently we all lost. Some bunch of junior academics, so someone actually looked it up. But during this conversation, we realized that there have only been about 50 or 60 world-changing human inventions. I mean, Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel goes through a list of them. It's like 27 long. Charles Murray, I think he tacked some on to kind of advantage Europe. I mean, he gets up to like 50. But to some extent, the 50 people that invented those things, like the breech-loading firearm, some of Alexander's cavalry tactics, like those were the people that changed the world. So I guess my question for you, Chris, is why did we move away from this idea that a few sociopathic, brilliant people are responsible for most of history? Because it's clearly true. I mean, footnotes to Aristotle and all that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an awesome question, really. And I think obviously some of it is just academic trends. And I think, like you said, there was kind of this trend to move towards sort of external explanations for things. If I'm being sort of cynical, I mean, I think, the last couple of decades have really seen the sort of a trend to sort of de-emphasize the West, if you will. Sort of and a lot of these books, and I've read, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and there's another one I can't remember the title of that was in this sort of like how the West won and how that's not going to stay that way. Again, that's not the title. It's something, but it's sort of in that vein. Because I can't remember things. I'm getting too old. I think there was this sense of like, the West became dominant in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century by chance, not due to anything that it necessarily advanced through its own merits, and that could have happened anywhere. And there's probably some element of truth to that. I'm not disputing that entirely. But I think that became really kind of trendy of saying like these people, like, the sort of heroes like George Washington or Alexander the Great or, whoever we're talking about really didn't matter that much. And these kind of like shifts, ebbs and flows in history are kind of like sine waves, that things advance and then they retract, and they advance and then they retract. And one culture is dominant for a while and then it retracts, and again, it's not that is wrong, but I think it also became the sense of, there was a little bit of a gleefulness, I think, in some academic circles with the idea, particularly that Asia was going to be next, that Asia was going to rise, and people, in particular China, is going to rise and become dominant in the next century. And I know on the right, people kind of look at that as a scary thing, something that people are worried about, because it is an authoritarian regime. But on the left, there was this kind of gleefulness, I think. At least that's what I sort of read into a lot of the narrative is that, there was people wanted to take away the heroes in the West and argue that this was just, sort of a random sort of accumulation of geographic and environmental and diseases and lucky inventions and things like that. That we had the horse in this hemisphere, but there was no horse in the Western Hemisphere, thus, the Aztecs never had a chance, and this sort of thing. So, I mean, I think that kind of became sort of a popular way of thinking of things. And again, I think it's got merit, but like a lot of popular things, it became very exclusionary. So, people kind of sort of focus on those explanations at the expense of acknowledging that sometimes individuals do matter and can really advance things. Like you said, it's nice to have a horse, but somebody needs to figure out how to train the dang thing at some point, because they don't like to normally have a human on their backs, so someone needs to figure out how to make that happen. And but that all got kind of taken away, I think, in some of this narrative.
But Chris, I mean, I don't want to veer too far from the book because I got a lot of stuff I want to say. But this is an interesting thing. So I believe that people were doing that, and I agree with you on that. But what's odd to me is, I don't think everybody agrees with it, but it's not like that unpopular of a thought. But I will agree with them. I would think that things would have happened, because if we agree that human nature is a we're different from other species, but because we have these, the reason and the other abilities, but at the same time, one group of people is not genetically better than the other. So
Sure.
they would have developed those things, but you got to give credit to when it happened. I mean, when it happened. So maybe something that was created in Europe that changed the world would have been done in China 30 years later. But that 30 years of when it happened may have made a difference, right? So they don't consider that. But also, those cynical people who are saying, they want to see the West to get their comeuppance, and they want to see somebody else. We like their power to fade and for someone else, but they don't have anything they want to replace it with. They don't have anything better. They're not saying the West is bad. So we would like to elevate this society who does this thing differently. They just have, a very negative view of the West, and so that's which is odd because that's all they know in most cases, right? So you have people who've never been out, many never been out of the United States, definitely haven't left the West, saying this is so bad. There's got to be somebody else out there better. I don't know who it is, and they're happy with that. So isn't that a strange way to
Yeah.
approach their hopeful existence in the future?
Yeah, absolutely it is. I mean, and you see this argument, again, made mainly by fairly well-to-do, middle class at very least, relatively elite people. And I think the recent one was, of course, there were the protests in Cuba over the summer, if I remember correctly, or in recent months, and there was a certain
Yep.
group of people who were defending the Cuban government.
Right.
But nobody moved. I imagine probably the Cuban government might be pretty open to some elite Americans who, had relatively known Twitter names and stuff, moving, essentially defecting to Cuba, or at least moving to Cuba.
Hmm.
But yeah, so there is a sort of sense of we're going to glorify. And it's particularly odd, like when it is these authoritarian regimes, but we're going to glorify Cuba, but I'm not going to move, So it's like,
Wait.
that's
While they're
fine, but
calling,
I
at least
moved to
not
Florida.
now, but also while they're calling our current administration, not this year but last year, authoritarian.
Yeah,
So we're living under a man who wants to be an authoritarian, but we're fighting against him. But we're
yeah,
going to celebrate the actual
yeah.
authoritarians in other countries. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of this comes down to like social pressure and how people get social capital, in a certain, well, in any group, really. It comes down to there are certain things that you say and everybody will applaud you for them, even if you don't take any actual action, on those things. And we can call that, performativity, or virtue signaling or whatever. Well, and of course, people on the right do it, people on the left do it. I'm not trying to completely slam, as you mentioned, I'm probably more on the left myself than I am on the right, but
Hmm.
so people do it on both sides. But I think that comes down to the sense of like we have this sense of other people around us want to see, and this is just a human thing. They want to see some degree of social conformity in us. And typically people that don't show that social conformity tend to suffer consequences. Whether
We should
that's
probably put a pin in that because you
yeah,
got a chapter on that of talking about the madness of the commune, and we'll come back to that. But since I talk about your approach being, kind of technical but in an approachable way, some of us need to get a better understanding of some of the, not necessarily terms, but the point you're making. So you talk about mental illness versus madness versus insanity, and how that the differences, the nuances between the three, and disorders, the personality disorders, and others, as opposed to what we would consider just being a physical or a mental illness. So talk about the differences between those.
yeah, absolutely. So I mean, obviously these terms do get used fairly interchangeably in sort of the general public. So I was trying to make some degree of distinction between them. The easiest one is insanity, which is a legal term. So we always talk about, well, Chris Ferguson's insane or whatever, but until a court of law decides that I'm insane, in fact, that term has relatively little meaning. So it's basically for insanity, your mental illness or other cognitive deficit has to be so severe that the court recognizes that you are not responsible for actions that you've taken that are illegal. So if you assault another person, you did it because you have a psychotic illness or an intellectual disability, and you believed either you didn't know what the law was because your capacity to understand it is so reduced, or you believed you were engaging in a legal action because of your mental illness. So, for instance, the voices are telling you that this other person is an evil Nazi who's come to kill you, and you think you're defending yourself. So it's a very, very specific sort of legal set of circumstances that is actually very hard to achieve. So people kind of think that it's widespread that insanity defenses are successful, but they really are not. On the other end is mental illness, which is very broad. In the way that the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, from the American Psychiatric Association, it's actually quite easy to get diagnosed with something. If you are a caffeine addict, you that technically is a mental illness. If you're afraid of spiders, if you are like me and have difficulty with attention, you'll see that over the course of the interview. You have to keep me on track. All these things count. If it's literally the case now, and I think I mentioned in the book that if your mother dies and you feel bad for 2 weeks, and that impairs your ability to have fun, which it kind of should, that's technically diagnosable as depression now. So it's really broad. So obviously there are lots of people who have a mental illness, they're struggling, they're upset, and they're functioning though, and they're not causing harm to anybody. They're not breaking the world or anything of that sort. They're getting by. They may not be as functional as they could be, but so mental illness is broad, everything from caffeine fiends all the way through schizophrenia and antisocial personality disorder, which we've already kind of hit upon a little bit. So it's a very wide range of things that are very disparate from each other. The only sort of commonality is that they're either interfering with the person's life or causing them some distress of one sort or another. And then sort of in between was madness. So madness, really the way I defined it, is sort of, having some sort of mental health situation that creates a pattern in which a person persists in behavior that is actively damaging either to themselves or to others. So really, the sort of sense of harm being done and persisting in the harm being done was more key to madness, which you don't necessarily see with all mental illnesses. It's probably more inherent to insanity as well, but insanity is very narrow and very specific to, so we might say, we could pick on Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, whoever we want, and say, well, this person's mad. They're persisting in actions that are bad for themselves and for the government or whatever. But they're not insane necessarily. They're able to function. They know what they're doing. More or less. Whether they're mentally ill or not, I have my suspicions in some of their cases, but then we get to the personality disorders, which you mentioned as well. So personality disorders are basically a lifelong pattern in which the person's sort of ability to understand what's going on in the world, perceive it accurately, and behave upon it is impaired in some sort of major way. So it's different from like a traditional mental illness, where with like depression takes you and changes you into being the sad, unhappy person. And theoretically, you could get treated for that, whether it's with medication or therapy, and that will change you back. So it's like having the flu in a way, and not maybe more serious, but it's sort of like you're normal, then you're not, but you can be returned to being normal again, possibly. Whereas a personality disorder, it's just who you are. This is you. There is no other more normal you out there. This is just this is just your personality, and personality is largely largely unchangeable across the life. It changes a little bit. It's not totally unchangeable, but for the most part, who you are when you're 16 is largely going to be who you are when you're 66, with some relatively minor changes across the lifespan. So, so if you have a narcissistic personality, you're always going to be a narcissist, and the ways that you interact with other individuals is always going to be influenced by that.
Well, I want to get Shamika and Will back in here, but I got to make sure I fit enough time for these 2 points that I want to mention. And because it's been a point of contention, you write about it in the book because it happened in the past, but it always comes up whenever there's a shooting. You're going to start to realize what I'm talking about. Or whenever somebody does something, some young kid does something outrageous, that his behavior, they try to find out why, and they look to this. So you mentioned in 2 separate places in the book. So I mean, you have a thing about this one, and I think I DM'd you about it too. So talk about this perception that, and Will's talked about this before too, that there's a gaming disorder, and that playing video games is what's causing, school shootings and all this other kind of stuff. So let's start with that one, and then I have another one for you.
Yeah, well, people love to blame like media and technology or culture on whatever perceived problem is out there. So the video game panic is just really one of the latest. Now we're actually kind of moving into social media,
Yep. Then social
but
media. Mhm.
but certainly the video game thing was this really big panic about the idea that you're basically taking these like normal male, mostly males, it's like 97% male. These normal guys, whether they're 12 or 72, and somehow playing the games or watching movies or television is changing them. They just can't tell reality from fiction, and it's making them into these mass homicide perpetrators, which is a real fundamental misunderstanding of how mass homicide works. But this has been disproven multiple times. In fact, just this month, myself and my student Miranda Sanchez published a study of mass homicide perpetrators, 169, firearm mass homicide perpetrators. And the short version is we found they actually consumed less video games, violent video games, than most other men of their sort of same age matched men. So this is a dead issue, but it keeps getting brought up for a variety of political and social reasons. Mostly it's catering to old people, so it's really the audience of older adults that, like this sort of stuff. They love to hear about whatever the kids today are doing is bad. For them.
What made me laugh in the book, I think you talked about, I think it was the Sandy Hook shooter, and they like, it's the video game. They looked it up, and he was playing Dance Dance Revolution.
Yes, you get these like weird cases, and
maybe there were messages in the game you didn't know about.
yeah, and then the other one was Virginia Tech. He ended up playing Sonic the Hedgehog mostly, which I guess if you really stretch the definition, you could say is a violent video game, but it's not what people are thinking about for the most part when you're thinking about video games. And you get these like other ones that I think like it turned out that the fellow down here in Florida is the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting.
Right.
They turned out he played like World of Warcraft, something like that. Like, have you played World of Warcraft? It's Lord of the Rings. It's not like yeah, it's a violent video game, but it's not that big a deal. So a lot of it is really sort of bred by people's unfamiliarity with video games, and to the extent that it is dying off. I mean, I think like I've been in this field now for 20 years, and it's at least from my perspective, much better than it was 20 years ago in terms of how people are talking about this stuff. But it's not because like somehow everybody's reading my research. I don't think that's the case at all. I'm always amazed when someone has, and I think it's just like this stuff is generational, and it's just the old people die. And then the audience for this goes away, and then we move on. That's why nobody cares about comic books or television anymore, or rock and roll.
Right, they used to say that, yeah.
Everybody's. If you go to like an Alice Cooper concert now, the average age is like 104. So the audience is just gone.
Maybe 99, Chris. Maybe 99. Well, I want Will to give us a comment on the gaming portion, and then go to Shamika to talk about the social media part.
Yeah, well, the gaming thing, that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, I think that we often have these evils du jour. So, I mean, like, what replaced rock as, like, the big bugaboo was just hip-hop and EDM. I mean, you started seeing conservative speakers talking about, like, DMX lyrics, like, I got blood on my hands, and I won't finish the lyric, but I mean, Cruella, like, dig me out. Like, they just took new styles of music and moved that in there. I mean, I would expect there to be almost no correlation once you adjust for things like has a father in the home between exposure to semi-violent content and violent behavior. Like, young men have always played war. I think people often think of their era or the threats of their time as somehow unique in all of time. Young people are especially prone to this. Like, every generation thinks they're the first to have discovered, like, fist fighting and oral sex and stuff. And they are shocking you, the product of the 1990s rave scene or the 80s gang scene or the 70s hippie scene or whatever. And I mean, that's not the case. But older people also often have this penchant. And the reality is that people have been complaining about the poets since, the ancient Greeks. They're telling these violent lies and singing these songs about war. So yeah, people have always played cowboys and Indians. People always had, football games that used to hospitalize, one boy in 10, organized snowball fights with 100 people involved. I don't really see any difference between that at all and being the sniper in GoldenEye or Call of Duty or whatever. So that doesn't surprise me. Actually, one of the things that's really interesting is that for men, there seems to be kind of a good relaxing effect of doing sort of bad shit theoretically. So, like, guys who watch a lot of porn, like consensual man, woman, sort of regular porn, are actually less likely, from everything I've ever read, to be wife beaters, to be involved in sexual assault. Because, I mean, you're probably in a consensual sexual relationship, and when you're not getting laid, you can plug in your computer. That's an incredibly logical finding. It's just, again, an amoral one. And it's the same thing with this. Like, if you are angry, you had a long day at work, you log online, you identify yourself as, fear itself or whatever, and you go shoot a few people. And that's much better than other things, like going to a bar and actually picking a fight. So if you have a certain level of anger, you can watch the ball game, or you can play the game, or you can actually go fight somebody. And I think a lot of people forget this. It's like the old line, the perfect is the enemy of the good. I think a lot of people want your reaction to feeling anger to be to meditate or give to charity or something like that as a 20-year-old man. No, the options are probably the game or the fight. The options probably are you hang out with your girl or you watch porn, or you go to a sleazy bar and try to pick someone up. I mean, so we actually find that stress relief valve has an incredible value. Last line. We seem to be, now we're running into some kind of creepy stuff kind of at the intersection of our professional fields. I mean, like, so should pedophiles be allowed to use sex dolls that look like 4-year-olds? I mean, I think there really are questions where almost everyone just is like, But the basic idea of controlling yourself by watching the video, or, by going to the boxing gym, or by playing Call of Duty, I think there's much more evidence of that than the reverse. That, like, young men in cities don't know how to fight and have never seen a gun. They learn that from video games. Like, I don't think that's the case at all.
Right. Now, Shamika, on the other side, when you talk about social media, it is similar but a little different, right? I would argue that it's more toxic than the video games, right? Because you got people piling on, you got the arguments, you got Will putting on funny noses. That only happens in social media. So, what do you think to that? Do you think that that is a little different than the other? Does that play a part? Do you think that it is? It can drive somebody. Like what Will said about the video games. I've always argued. I agree with Chris for the most part, and Will, that that's not the cause, but I think it's an accelerant. So it's just like anything else. It's not worse than, hanging out with the gang or doing other things. But if you take the father from the home and there's nobody out there and you give them, a lot of bad influences, and that's the only thing they have, they tend to take the negative out of it because they have nothing to balance it. So I think that that could be the problem with the gaming, but it's not the game itself. And it may be the same thing with social media. What are your thoughts on whether social media is doing the culture a disservice?
I definitely think social media is doing the culture a disservice. But when I think about that, when I look at how kids are so depressed, or like they actually, if they don't get enough likes, then they feel some type of way. Whereas I don't really pay attention to that. I don't feel like I care as much. And so what I'm wondering is that because we kind of dealt with that stuff still, but in person, and now they're kind of having to deal with it publicly? Because I do think maybe as a child, I was more concerned maybe how someone felt about me. And so then I got past that, and I'm not as concerned now as an adult. So I'm wondering if the kids are still going through the same processes that we did, but now it's kind of in public and with different things as social media. Are they still going through the same, I guess, dealing with the same things that we encountered, but just differently?
What do you say to that, Chris? Do you think social media is a little bit different because, the age? I mean, they both can be addictive. I mean, but I think the game addictive if you're playing it for long hours a day and it gets addictive. It's like you're looking for this adrenaline rush.
Yeah.
Whereas with social media, when you're a teen and you're addicted all day, you're looking for like the likes. It's like it's specifically designed to make you stay on, right? To keep you on, and you're looking for likes and you're looking for popularity and you're counting how many followers you got. So the draw is a little different. So what do you think of particularly middle school and young high school kids? Either the guy playing video games all day or the kid on social media, which is probably worse?
Yes, that's a great question. So nobody loves social media. So if you're going to make me pick between video games and social media, it's not
It's
even,
social media,
not
yeah.
even close. If I have to sacrifice one of these things, it's clearly going to be Twitter. Well, I mean, I think what we tend to find with what we're calling addictions or behavioral overuse disorders or whatever we tend to call these things, is that you tend to find a certain subset of people who are just really prone to this, and they tend to have sort of pre-existing mental health issues, whether that's depression, anxiety, ADD, that sometimes autism spectrum kids, or adults for that matter. And what you tend to find is that there actually is a wide variety of research on sort of these behavioral addictions, or what you want to call them. And what it turns out, people can become addicted to almost anything. So there are research papers on food addiction, exercise, work, religion. There even are papers on, I think it's fascinating, the ideas of dance addiction. There's a couple of research papers on that, and fishing addiction, which is a fascinating concept for me. So I think what it kind of boils down to is it actually was a paper that came out this year. It was kind of satirical, but it was a real published paper. It was on real life friend addiction. So I think they just were kind of having fun at this point with some of this stuff. But what it really boils down to, if you kind of use the there's really like these 9 symptoms that they use for all these things. They're all basically identical. You just take out heroin, stick in video games, that's the same symptom. And if you go by that set of symptoms, then you can find that a subset of people, would qualify as being sort of quote unquote addicted to anything you can think of. Cheese, I don't know, golf, anything. Some people overdo it with almost any activity. So I think with like the social media stuff, there are some things we've gotten wrong, but I think there are also some real issues with social media. I talk about some of those in the book. So in the sense, what's got everybody's attention right now is this idea that like teen girls are killing themselves because they're on social media. And I think that the evidence for that is pretty slim. And a lot of it was this Facebook study that came out a couple months ago that, if you actually look at it, is a really badly done study. And granted, it's Facebook's, they shot themselves in the foot with it. But in terms of, and if there's a company you could, not like, I mean, Facebook is an unlikable company, no doubt about it. But I think what we're doing is kind of like playing blind men with the elephant here to some extent. Everybody's kind of talking about like suicides in teen girls, which are actually pretty rare. So what's happening is they actually started a relatively low level of suicides, and now it is increasing. There's no question about that, but it's increasing from a relatively low base rate. If you're looking at the groups who kill themselves the most, it tends to be 2 groups. One is middle-aged white men, and the other is young Native American men. Those are the 2 groups that far and beyond anybody else killed themselves at far higher rates. And the numbers of the increase in those suicides have been much larger than with teens. The problem is if you have like 1,000 50-year-old white guys like me killing themselves each year, and that goes up to 1,200 from 1,000, that percentage increase is much smaller than 10 girls going to 20 girls, which that's a 100% increase, so it sounds more dramatic, and it's not good. I mean, nobody wants, anybody to kill themselves, but it sometimes can create this misimpression that there's like this scourge of teen suicides, when what it really seems to be, if you're looking at like teen mental health, and I see this even anecdotally with my students more recently, but certainly in terms of the data we see as well, is that a lot of this stuff is intergenerational. So you have like teens that are stressed, but they're stressed because their parents are stressed, and they're stressed because their parents are dying, and they're losing their job, and a lot of other things are going on, and that really what we see is in terms of like what makes a teen kill themselves, there really are like 2 big predictors, at least in some of the data I've worked with. One is being bullied by other teens, tends to be pretty bad. And the other is being in an environment where other people kill themselves. So if their family members have killed themselves or their friends have killed themselves, that seems to be kind of a big predictor. Whether they've watched like 13 Reasons Why or they've used a lot of social media does not seem to be a big predictor. But in fact, 13 Reasons Why seems to be negatively correlated with actual teen suicides, at least in some of the data I've worked with. Now, I think what happens in going back to the question, I think that, there is, however, these real risks of whatever's happening in these teen. So like when I was, 15, I was an idiot, people still think I'm an idiot, but I was much more of an idiot when I was 15, than today. And if everything I had said when I was 15 was caught and historically available to anybody forever, it would be a nightmare. I'm sure it would be a nightmare. I don't know what I said, but I'm sure I said stupid shit that would offend people, and I would be horrified by some of that, and hopefully I've gotten wiser, and So I think there are real risks that, and we're seeing this again sort of anecdotally with some cases of these teens. They said something stupid on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. They shouldn't have said it. It's horrible what they said. But they were 13, and now they're 18, and they can't get into university, or they're getting fired from their job. And so I think that's a real risk for teens. That is something that we didn't have to experience when we were teenagers. We were free to be stupid, and if we were stupid and offended someone, that was bad, but at least it was local and wouldn't haunt you for the rest of your days. So there's that kind of an issue, and I think there are other challenges with social media. These companies are very powerful, and now I think, in my opinion, there are real concerns about their control of the flow of information. It's something I call de facto censorship. I don't know that I want Facebook and Twitter to control the news that I get to access and stuff. I understand sometimes their reasons may be, sometimes I understand the reason, but I don't think that the outcome is going to be good, necessarily. There's like the Hunter Biden laptop story, which Twitter and Facebook suppressed, and that sort of stuff, which I don't think, I should be able to read a New York Post article without, Facebook protecting me from it. Or something of that sort. Yeah, maybe it's wrong in the end. That's fine, but I have the right to read it. I think I should have the right to read it.
Uh-oh, Shamika's got something to say. Go ahead, yeah. Shamika.
Well, I wanted him to talk a little bit about genetics and environment. I think you said something in the book about, 50% is genetics and then the other is environment. Obviously, I'm trying to diagnose myself in this hour.
Right. Go ahead and get your money's worth. Right. But when's your hard stop? Because I got another question. I know you got to go. What time? When's your hard stop?
Like in about 7 minutes.
Whoa.
All right, let me see if I can quickly answer your question. Yeah, so it depends on the condition you're talking about. So certainly we talk about like mental health issues. That at the very extreme end, there are some conditions like obviously, well, the very extreme would be like,
what do you want, Shamika?
I just want to tell him, so like I'm a product of rape.
Okay.
So
I'm very sorry to hear that. Yeah.
So if it's like genetics, then I'm like, obviously my father was a little bit, off.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
He's like, now go ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
I might interrupt you again to give you some more specific information.
Right.
Yeah. No, I understand. No, I appreciate.
I don't think Chris was expecting some of these bombs to hit him. Ali Fist style.
This question is not on the list. Is it? Okay.
What are they doing?
Yeah. So no. So it really depends. So at the very extreme, there are some conditions like Down syndrome that's fully genetic, has no environment, has nothing or near nothing to do with it. You're just born with it, and that's the way it goes. But below that you have like your schizophrenia. That is almost entirely genetic. Something like 80% of the variance in schizophrenia is genetic variance. A small amount is due to stress and things like that. And then you come down to really kind of the conditions we're more, I think, for the book, are most interested in. So like the personality disorders, like antisocial personality disorder, which is what you're referring to. It's about 50-55% of the variance in antisocial behavior is genetic. About 10 or between 0 and 10% is due to sort of family environment stuff, like childhood abuse or just family practices, parenting practices, and the remaining is kind of unknown variance, but it's probably just due to unique things that you experience in your life, and that could include things like trauma, of course. And then down sort of like the very end of it is more like the anxiety disorders and depression. There's probably like 20-30%. Some of it is still inherited, but a lot of like think of like PTSD, like post-traumatic stress disorder. You need to have trauma. You need to be exposed to something stressful, to get the condition. So obviously, there's a very big environmental input into something like that. So it really is going to vary from one condition to another one. How much of that pie, if you will, is due to genetics or is due to the environment. So what we tend to find is that like the bad combination is having genetic risk and then being exposed to a harsh environment in early childhood. That's really like the bad mixture that you want to try to avoid in most situations. Now, again, if some kids are exposed to trauma and they just, I don't want to say don't notice it. Of course they notice it, but a year later they're fine, and you just can't even detect any mental illness in them, and then other people it's what we call resiliency. So, even this concept of resiliency does vary from some people to others. And a lot of that probably comes down to personality, which comes down to genetics, so some people are just going to be more susceptible to the impact of environmental stressors than others. And that's same thing in terms of our day-to-day behavior. The more stressed we are, the more antisocial we behave. But some people, like I think I'm pretty chill for the most part. So I haven't like bashed anyone over the head with a beer bottle at any point in my life, but other people have, so, and, the amount, and of course, a certain amount of stress, someone shows up at my house with a gun and tries to kill my family, I'm going to be pretty aggressive, and trying to protect them, but it's going to take something higher. Other people, you go into a pub and you say Manchester United sucks and they try to kill you, so the trigger for different people in terms of how much stress it takes them to get aggressive can vary from one to the other. And again, that's where you see this sort of combination of genetic risk and early childhood experiences kind of setting them up for those triggers.
So, Chris, I told you I didn't even get through, scratch the surface of what I wanted to talk about. Time goes fast. Maybe you have to come back, but I do want to leave you with one more thing.
Yeah.
In the book, you talked about stuff like, the way things was used to be diagnosed of, like homosexuality, drapetomania, which I always laugh when I hear it, even the gaming disorder. And so I want to talk a bit about how even medical professionals and psychiatrists and other people, educated people, can be wrong. People just always want to tell you about a study. I know I tagged you in something where somebody was attacking me, talking about, well, how can you dismiss this study about racist babies? These are psychologists. The APA confirmed it, and who are you, just a layman, to say that they're wrong? Well, I got a little bit of common sense. I don't know what to tell you. So, tell me a bit about that, about how we take some of the things that they say as the gospel. Like, we know this is fact, as these things evolve over time, and how that affects the way we look at these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, so scientists are humans, and they respond to social pressure like everybody else does, to some extent. There are, so there are legitimate mental illnesses. I mean, people with schizophrenia have schizophrenia, and that's just the way it is, and it's not like a made-up thing. But for decades, people have sort of pointed out that there are other issues around psychiatry and psychology where people are really sort of interpreting sort of moral turpitude, whatever that means in a given generation. So people that are heterodox, if you will, or people who sort of deviate from the norm, that they must be mentally ill. So mental illness is sometimes used to it's like almost like a method of control, right? So we saw that with drapetomania, where the idea that, I mean, I don't, even in this time, it wasn't really a popular thing, but it's sort of, fascinating to talk about that at least anybody took this seriously, that, slaves who try to escape must be mentally ill or something of that sort. And certainly the same thing with homosexuality, that you had individuals who were just deviating from what society considered to be acceptable at that time, and therefore were diagnosed as mentally ill. You see this with the gamers today. If you're having fun playing 8 hours a day on the game machine, then you must be mentally ill. Something wrong with you. So there are these. You see with like a lot of the addictions, that all the addictions are morally turpitude sort of behaviors. Nobody talks about religion addiction, or even work addiction. There's some papers on it, but it doesn't get any excitement the same way that like gaming or porn addiction or things like that do. So there is a sort of sense of moral control around these things, and then you do get these organizations like the American Psychological Association, of which I'm a fellow. That's probably not going to last for very much longer. I'm likely to resign in the near future. But they're professional guilds. And by the way, make it clear, resign out of protest because of their behavior, not because I'm in bad standing.
You're not going to apologize for all the racism you've created?
I'm not going to. No. Yeah, that's a thing. Yeah, that was a thing. So it worked
harm we cause.
It worked about as well as anybody could have predicted. It just made people angrier all around, including the people they were apologizing to, or things.
Right, they're actually helping the wacky 1619 people. I want to get Will in here in a minute, but here's an example. The drapetomania is funny because I knew about it. A lot of people don't. 1619, my book has a chapter on all of it. And in that chapter, they talked about that. But see, you just made a clear point. It's like this guy, Sam McCartwright said this, and he was a prominent doctor, but nobody really took that piece seriously. It's not like the whole country was saying, oh, what do we do about this new disease? But they took what he said, what he wrote, and found a way to put it in the 1619 Project in 2019 and say, see, this is what all the whites thought,
Right,
right?
right.
And so all it is doing, it's the same thing that the APA is doing now, thinking
Yeah,
they're helping. You're just giving them fuel to that fire. Say, see, even
yeah.
they're admitting that they're all racist. So that's what for Will Riley and Charles Love to say all whites aren't racist. What are you talking about? They even telling us themselves they're racist. So they don't even realize how they're just feeding into the negativity and making it worse and not better.
Yeah. Well, it's a failure to provide the full context, with a lot of these things. So, like with the drapetomania, I mean, Cartwright was, lampooned at the time, and granted, it was a South-North divide. So
Right.
physicians in the North thought he was ridiculous, and and obviously, it was catnip to people in the South.
Right. People who liked it would cherry pick it, right? Like, see?
But that's a detail. I mean, so it's fair to talk about it, but it's also, you ought to mention all the details, so to give the full picture of it. But yeah, I mean, so the APA is a professional guild. They're not a science organization. I've had longstanding disputes with them about video games and other issues. And now keep in mind, not 5 years ago, they were essentially, caught with their own internal investigation, participating in torturing detainees in Guantanamo Bay. So that's like the level of like, like how serious we should. Anyway, so I mean, the same thing. They just do what it's a business, and so
Right.
it's a marketing firm that happens to have psychologists who also are members.
Right.
So they do what is in the interest of the APA. They are not, and whatever seems to be, and they're left. They're hard left. Like I said, I'm on the left, but I'm not that far left. They're really catering to, like you said, the 1619, the Black Lives Matter, that whole movement, because it seems politically expedient right now for them to do so. 5 years ago, they were torturing the people from the Middle East in Guantanamo Bay. So it shows you how quickly they will move. With the, or they weren't directly tortured, but they changed their ethics code to
Right, to
make
say
it
it was
permissible
okay.
for psychologists to do that, sort of thing.
Will, what do you got? Will,
Yeah, I mean, so no, it was a good conversation going on. I think that the one thing I take from this, because this actually is something that's really relevant to like the woke trad debate going on right now. This idea of how dare you challenge the experts. I think that a good starting point for looking at this is that there are two kinds of things that get referred to as science. Mm-hmm. The first is a replicable, as a political scientist, I'd say preferably quantitative, actual finding that's in a table in a paper. It's something that someone discovered using a skill like regression analysis or deep interviewing that actually takes some training to have. So, for example, like if my doctor tells me that I need to lower my cholesterol by 1.2 percentage points, I have no idea how to map that against a healthy but overweight human male body, and I'm going to listen to the doc. So that's expertise type 1 to kind of Tom Sowell it. Like some replicable thing that comes from a technical professional skill that takes long training. Like an electrician is an expert in his field. They're also blue collar experts. I don't know how to build a yacht. So that's type 1. Type 2, I think, is just sort of some random thing that's said by someone with a degree. Yeah. And this is where like all the announcements from professional organizations fall. Like, as a poli-sci guy, I really don't know why the sociologists keep announcing shit about global geopolitics. Right. Like, they don't really know a lot about it. Yeah. And so you'll see all these things like, we support the Palestinian Authority against the corrupt government of Israel. And if you know anything about the Palestinian Authority, like, they're not the good guy in that situation. So that's just a scientist talking.
Or the CDC saying racism is a health scare. Just worry about the diseases.
Yeah. But so the second set is just something that somebody with a credential says. That's like almost every published statement. It's also, including mine, except for the data tables, like most popular press books, except for Chris's. But I mean, it's just that second category of science. Like if you're just a high IQ normal citizen, sure you can criticize it. Like if someone says, I think slaves were happy. If you get into the drapetomania papers and like the contented Negroes literature and so on, you could say, well, George, that sounds like bullshit. Did you sit them down? Did you do any kind of the test you guys do over there? And it's like, oh, no, we just said they were happy. Okay. They did some dancing. That kind of thing is not especially important. And I think this is a good time to kind of insist on this right now. And psych is a field that's kind of found itself in the crosshairs of a lot of this. I mean, so we've seen, for example, the DSM-5, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but like redefining gender identity disorder so that being trans is only a problem if it makes you feel bad. They're issuing position papers saying they're open to the idea of genders other than the traditional male and female. So like the non-binary and like demon self chicks and so on might get shouted out in professional psych literature. This is just science type 2. Like someone with a degree is saying random crap. Like I guarantee if you did any standard biological blood work on people that identify as demons, they're just humans, they're kinky college girls. We know what this would be if anyone ever subjected it to a test. So I think when you're confronted with science type 2, like there are a lot of questions to ask. Charles, you asked the most important one. Does this make sense in common sense terms? Right. Like my ex says she's a devil. While I might sympathize with that, what are the odds that she actually is? That she got to this nightclub from hell? Okay, so that's point one, common sense. But also, like, what do the experts in other civilized countries like China, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, what do they say about what seems like American campus horseshit? Like, are there a lot of transgender Russians right now? If not, why not? Right. You know, what did experts say in the past? So what did the DSM-4 say? I think that when people make an extraordinary claim, the old line is that does require extraordinary evidence. And I think that's pretty much correct.
Right, but it also goes back to they not only do they just make this stuff up, but then they twist it to their advantage. Like this guy who was attacking me with a study. Like, who was it? Nicole Hannah-Jones, who came after Bob Woodson and the fine people at the 1776 Unites, and say, well, why? I mean, he's a nice old man, but why listen to him? He's not a historian. Well, I looked at all the people on the 1776 Unite side and all the people who wrote essays at the 1619, and only one of them was a historian, and he's the idiot who wrote about traffic jams being linked to slavery. He's the one. So I mean, what do you mean? Is she? No one even questioned. Is she a historian?
I was going to say that was an odd question.
It's that simple. Look, Bob Woodson is not a historian. Yes, neither are you.
That, by the way, is something that 1619 has been allowed to slide on like an incredible amount. Like, I actually don't take credentials all that seriously. Like, you meet a lot of just smart people doing any normal adult thing. But I mean, like, if you look at the lineup for 1776 Unites with, like, Shelby Steele and Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter and John Sibley Butler and Carol Swain, like, when people are asking, are these actual social scientists or, I mean, like, Judge Denise Brown, when people get into the law, like, yeah, they're actually pretty famous ones.
Exactly.
You know, so the response when people say, are you guys a bunch of unqualified hacks? No, but you might be. No one's ever asked these questions, as far as I can tell, of 1619. Like Nicole Hannah-Jones, and I'm not a hater, you know, get your money, but Nicole Hannah-Jones is a tenured college professor. Nicole Hannah.
I don't even know if she really should be a tenured college professor, though. No, but okay,
that's what I'm saying, like that's the point. And again, it sounds.
I mean, 6 months ago, she was just a journalist with no book, no credentials, and no tenure.
Yeah, but I don't know, Charles. Like, I don't know how much you follow academic politics, but she was hired like on the tenure track at UNC. And she has either a bachelor's or a master's in journalism.
Right.
I don't even know if that's the field she was hired in. So, like, when she starts talking about, like, I don't know how good a historian John Sibley Butler is, it's like, well, one, you're not a historian at all. And two, you guys have been rewarded at a ridiculously high level. I mean, these are like Pulitzer Prize winning organizations. And it's obviously not, although there are some interesting essays in 1619.
Yeah, I mean, they're well written. I mean, my challenge is that they leave stuff out. You want true history, don't leave stuff out, right?
Absolutely, no, but it's like, but the question is that like the least factually challenged, like best job of investigative reporting done in 2020 when people were writing about COVID and so on? No, it's like Ibram Kendi one of the country's top 25 geniuses this year? Not like, does he deserve to be on the tenure track? Because probably a decent number of books. But like when MacArthur is giving this group of people, like 14, I think, of the 25 geniuses were black leftists this year. Right. What's the percentage of the country that's made up of black leftists?
Right.
So at a certain point, you have to start saying, obviously, scientists are people. Obviously, there's some political bias going on here. Like, okay, how many of those 25 people rank ahead of Thomas Sowell? Or while I disagree with him on genetics, Charles Murray, or 100 other people, Siegel and Spaeth in the legal space. Are those the 25 smartest guys in the country? Probably not.
Have you seen this the promo? I'm sure you've seen these promos for these master classes. Have you seen the one on I don't know if it's politics or race or whatever it is, some kind of critical thinking thing, and they have these. It's like nine people, and the list is John McWhorter and eight leftists.
And John McWhorter himself is not. I mean, that's like Chris here. That's not a far right guy.
Right, he's not a concern. Right, but still, I'll give him that he's not a hard leftist, right? Or especially on these topics. But everyone else was. I'm like, see, we have the greatest minds, right? With one guy and then eight guys who think alike.
Well, and it really is like this actually like I think we've made a couple of important points here. Like I mean Chris defended like gaming young male gamers are actually kind of under attack. It seems silly to say that, but I mean that's a very valid point that was made during this interview. But I think that another valid point here is that it's important when people say like you're outside the consensus or you're heterodox to realize that that's complete BS almost anywhere in the country. Like we all live in
Right.
big cities and participate in like the non-military, non-business section of intellectual life. So, I mean, it might seem that way, but in reality, if you ask something like, can people decide to be genders other than male and female literally at will? Even if the Psychological Association says yes, which I predict here they will within 10 years, the vast majority of people, biologists, economists, I mean, everyone else who is intelligent, master sergeants looking at soldiers coming in, know that's not true. So, like, when you say John McWhorter is the most right-wing of the serious intellectuals in this country, that means you've ignored, like, but I mean, you've ignored, like, everyone at AEI. It's just, you're just saying crap. So I think it's important for intelligent people who see that to say, well, what about me? Kind of. I mean, like, what are your qualifications here? And as more and more people start saying that, as you start seeing these intelligent, up-middle class alternatives, FAIR, 1776, so on, arise, it's going to be harder to do this. Like, you can't just say, well, the debater from 1776 unites as a Nazi. Well, they're all black. I mean, they're going to have to at least retrench.
Well, I want to cut. I told you I could have kept going, Chris, but Will usually has a hard stop. But I do, since we kept going, I do want to. I want to come to you, but you don't even have to respond to that because we said a lot. So I'll narrow the scope for you. He mentioned that you were your approach was very like you just debunked a lot of the things that they say, and it's a very normative response. Even though they act like you're outside the norm, no, you're the norm. They're being radical. You did say a couple things that I wanted to ask you about. One thing I agree with 100%. I just like no one really says that. You talk about them, and I talk about this. They say mental illness doesn't, increase. I mean, doesn't, point to violence, right? And people will say, yeah, that's true. And why are you saying they're all violent? And in the book, though, you say, yes, that's true. However, that study didn't really, it's kind of like when they just take all of blacks and say blacks commit 50% of the murder. So that means black men are all murderers or half of them are murderers. No, you have to take the subset of the people. You can't take all blacks, right? And that's what you say. So it depends on the disorder, right? So for certain disorders, yes, they're more likely to be violent. And most people would just, would cringe and say, you can't say that. So speak to that. And your point on the cognitive behavioral therapy, you talk about how there are, there's few proven benefits to it, and I'm sure you've at least read the Calling of the American Mind. I know Greg Lukianoff talks about that at length and how that's beneficial, and one of the things that he points to as help with his mental illness. So, what are your expound on a little bit on your views on both of those takes?
Yeah, I mean, I think like what if you're talking about like mental illness. So what happens is people talk about mental illness, and they'll start off by like saying people who are mentally ill are not more likely to commit violent crime. Well, yeah, if you're talking about like a fear of spiders, sure, I mean, I think that's true. And so what people will do is they'll kind of like start off with this broad definition of mental illness and say, well, that's not really correlated with crime, which is accurate. If you look at specific disorders like schizophrenia, then you actually see somewhere between a 3 to 5 times increase in prevalence. Again, it doesn't mean everybody, as you said, it doesn't mean even the majority of people with schizophrenia commit violent crimes, but the number is something like 10 to 15%, which is much higher than the general population. So they're very clear linkage between psychotic disorders and, of course, antisocial personality disorder and a few other disorders and violent crime. So there definitely is some flattening. And then what they'll kind of do is then they'll say, well, while the mentally ill are more likely to be, victimized, by, which also is true, but then you're limiting it to schizophrenia again. So in other words, a limit to schizophrenia when it's convenient, and then broaden it out when it's convenient, and they're not really talking about the same things. Or they'll say, in one study, it said, well, only 5% of crimes are committed by people with schizophrenia, violent crimes. This is a Swedish study, if I remember correctly. 5% of violent crimes are committed by people with mental illness. Well, you define that as schizophrenia. So 5% of crimes are committed by people with schizophrenia, but people with schizophrenia occupy 1%.
Right, yeah. How many people are there? Right. That's like 7 people.
So that's actually a 500% increase in the likelihood of committing violent crime that we're talking about. So there's a lot of a shell game that is going around.
Well, us normal people would say we don't have the benefit of doing a study. Just come to New York.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or work in a psychiatric facility. I've worked in a psychiatric hospital. I worked in jails. I worked in psychiatric hospitals. And I tell you that you walk in any day and you don't know you're going to get assaulted. In these facilities. So assaults are very common in psychiatric hospitals. I felt safer in a jail. Mostly because they were big guys who would have to jump on anybody who got out of line, as opposed to me in a psychiatric. They want me to do it. And I'm telling you, you don't want me to be the guy that's like public safety,
Last line of defense.
Like I said, I haven't hit anything since I was probably 12 or something, so I'm going to hide behind a rock. I'm not going to lie. So there is this kind of like shell game around some of that stuff. So definitely it is the case that with certain types of mental, now again, that doesn't mean we should stigmatize the mentally ill, that we should be cruel to them, that, these individuals
Right,
are
of course.
treated.
But Will was going to say something. Will, what were you going to say?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that this is an excellent example of just this idea that common sense has value. Like, again, we've all lived in good-sized cities. Like, the people you see... So, first of all, a brief moment on homelessness. One of the big lies out there, especially on the political left, is that the problem with the homeless is that they don't have homes. Right. I.e., like, if you opened up a nice condo building to homeless derelicts and you put everyone, there's a nicer term there, but you put everyone in a nice 2-flat, like, you'd have solved the homeless problem. The reality is that when that's actually been tried, you get, like, the New York COVID hotels. Like, you get people having sex in the elevators and stealing the copper piping out of the walls. Right. Because there's an obvious untreated mental illness issue there. Like, if you walk through, like, Lower State Street in Chicago, you're talking about textbook schizophrenics. Like, people walking around talking angrily to MFs that aren't there. And it's just ridiculous to deny this. Like, Andrew Yang got a lot of heat because he was talking about a casual female friend of his who was posting in her mom group that she was, like, on the bus, and a guy just punched her in the face, jacked her, grabbed her. She was able to, like, escape, but there was this physical attack from someone that was obviously insane, that was mumbling, that might be on drugs. That's a huge part of the homeless situation, and anyone that lives in an urban area has to recognize that. I mean, so anyway, enough with the homeless. But, like, in terms of common sense, most people recognize that if someone is dangerously mentally ill, again, not addicted to caffeine pills or something like that, but they're any of the terms we've been using throughout the interview, a schizophrenic, perhaps a psychopath, I mean, dissociative personality disorder, something like that, they are more likely, even if just because they're provoked or something happens in their brain that scares them, to commit a violent act. So in general, Chris's explanation was the first time I kind of knew how we do that one in social science. But I would assume that any paper that finds that the mentally ill are less likely to commit crimes, yeah, that includes like people who have sex addictions. They're busy. I mean, and that's how all this stuff always works. Like, the proof of systemic racism is that there's a gap in income between black guys and white guys. And you just stop it there. You don't do like the next model that would look at what's age, what's education, so on.
So is that the problem, Will? That no one questions anymore? I mean, outside of the radical leftists that just have an agenda, but I see that people will just see a study and they say, "See, I told you."
Well, I think it's that we have a culture, for all our stuff about experts don't know what they're talking about. We have a culture in the USA of greatly respecting the independently made expert because we don't have a nobility here, for example. So how do people advertise their social class? They put their colleges on their car. I mean, and no one does it jokingly, no one does it sardonically. Like, I've never seen one Stanford sticker cut and edited to spell snod fart or something like that. Like the obvious jokes, because that is like your baronage. You know, so we're used to listening to people. What we haven't understood is the level of institutional capture that's taken place in a lot of fields. And a lot of these terms feel kind of like right-wingy and conspiratorial when you say them. But like talking online with pretty serious people in left-wing social science, like Rod Graham, Matsushita, any of the people that are in the thread I'm in right now, you realize like individually these are nice guys, but every one of these people is probably a communist. Like in some fields, like sociology in particular, it's like 98 leftists to 2 moderates and conservatives.
Mm-hmm.
So that what you're seeing is something that's filtered through a very partisan lens. And I'm not even going to get into the IQ element of this, but we've also had 60 years of legacy admissions and affirmative action. So I don't know if these guys are really at the World War II atom bomb level of brilliance on average in the education department. But you have 98.
But hey, we have more minorities, and that's what's more important.
Well, the minorities actually in education aren't that far behind the whites in terms of test scores, but the average SAT is like 1040 or something like that.
Right,
I mean, but the point is, like, I'm not trying to like crap on whole fields here. It's just if you have a whole bunch of people that just have human normal intelligence, they're not stupid, but they're not Einsteins either, and 98% of them lean in one political direction, your take on a research paper they produce should be, well, this comes from a bunch of people with that 1040 score that all lean in one political direction. It shouldn't be the experts have spoken necessarily. Right. But a lot of people haven't gotten to that level yet.
Yeah,
I tend to be pretty alert to cliches myself. That's like a thing for me. And with the APA, I mean, the one thing that came out, what it was May, June 2020, when they released their first statement post George Floyd, and they referred to a pandemic of racism, which to me, I mean, is obviously a cliche taken from COVID-19. I mean, so that, you know, you have a science organization that is using buzzwords that are obviously emotionally picked from another worldwide event, you know, that, and what do you mean by that? You know, where's the, first off, it's a pretty inflammatory thing to say without some pretty clear evidence. You know, and I use the word inflammatory very specifically. You know, but what do you mean by that, and what data do you have to support that? You know, and I think that's the sort of thing, like, you know, like I said, I get into, you know, I'm pretty much at the point where like this is probably the end of the road for me in the APA, because it's just some of the stuff, even ethically, you know, if they're picking on video games and they're just dug their heads in the sand about video games, well, that's probably not going to hurt anybody. It's just going to make some gamers feel bad. It's not a big deal, maybe, but when they're starting to get political with some of this stuff, then, you know, it could hurt people, I think, you know. Right. And so it's not,
One final comment for me, because I think Charles is probably going to close the show, but I mean, just in terms of one of the things that I look for that's related to your cliches is the lack of any provable, quantifiable definition. And this absolutely goes together. So when you say like a pandemic of racism, not only is that a hokey ass thing for a scientist to say, like at a come on bro level, but I mean, you have to ask the question, like, is racism killing more than 10,000 people a year in each of 8 countries in the zone you're looking at? Like, I guarantee it's not. Nope. There are not 10. If you look at, say, the U.S. and the Eurozone, I mean, our deaths are a direct result of racism per year. Like, unarmed police shootings plus black on white killings, take both sides. That's like 400. I mean, it's not, and only 20 of those are unarmed police killings. Right. So that's just not true. And you keep seeing these statements that are almost undefinable, and when you finally shove a definition down their throat, then the statement is wrong. That is one of the lead-in things for me. The ultimate example of this, just to pick on a hobby horse you both see me bitch about every day online, but is the sort of the Ibram Kendi definition of racism, where the idea is that we know racism exists because gaps between people exist, but his definition of racism in the other book is like gaps between people. So you're just saying, like, I know racism exists because there's all this racism. And it's impossible. And if you actually sit someone down and try to have a conversation, it's just, you unpack cliches for 30 minutes and then you just get down to bedrock BS, basically. That's true across a lot of fields.
Right. So we could obviously keep going, but I think we've been an hour and a half already. So I think that we're just going to have you back to finish that. I got to get back to the title. The book is How Madness Shaped History, an eccentric array of maniacal rulers, raving narcissists, and psychotic visionaries. He is Chris Ferguson, professor of psychology at Stetson University. Chris, thank you for joining us. It's been great.
This has been awesome. I appreciate you guys thinking of me for this. Happy to be back anytime.
Well, thank you.
From you commies who let know you can't fuck with me. I got a country to say. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.